The sun hadn't yet broken over the horizon, but the air in Wilcox County, Alabama was already thick enough to choke on. It was late July, 1857, and the heat clung to everything like a second skin, sticky, oppressive, inescapable. In the pre-dawn darkness, there was a sound cutting through the silence of the cotton fields. Not the gentle rustle of wind through the stalks, not the distant call of a mockingbird preparing for morning. No, this was different. This was the sound of a man screaming. You see, there are certain sounds that human beings are not meant to make. Sounds that come from a place so deep inside us that they bypass language entirely and speak directly to something primitive, something that understands suffering without needing words to explain it. The sound echoing across Franklin Patterson's plantation that morning was one of those sounds. It was the sound of a human body being pushed beyond what it was designed to endure. The sound of flesh and bone and spirit being tested in ways that no person should ever have to experience. But here's the thing about cruelty. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't wear a sign or declare its intentions. Sometimes the most horrific acts in human history happened in quiet places, witnessed only by the morning dew and the indifferent sky above. And on this particular plantation, in this particular corner of the antebellum South, cruelty had found a home and made itself comfortable. Franklin Patterson was what you might call a practical man, at least by his own measure. He was 53 years old, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that had been weathered by decades of Alabama sun into something resembling old leather. He stood just under 6 feet tall, carried himself with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of military service in his youth, and had eyes that looked at other human beings the way a merchant might look at livestock, assessing their value, calculating their usefulness, determining their worth in dollars and cents. Patterson owned 470 acres of prime cotton land, worked by 63 enslaved people whose names he barely bothered to learn. To him, they were tools, no different than the plows that cut through the red Alabama clay or the cotton gins that separated fiber from seed. And like any tools, when they broke or malfunctioned or failed to perform to his satisfaction, they needed to be corrected. Now, most plantation owners in that part of Alabama used the whip. It was brutal, yes, but it was also straightforward, quick. A few lashes, a few screams, a few scars, and the message was delivered. Pain was the language of control, and the whip spoke it fluently. But Franklin Patterson considered himself more creative than that, more innovative. He believed that true punishment wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was about breaking the spirit, about creating a spectacle so terrible that others would never dare to step out of line. And so he had invented something he called the Scarecrow. Imagine for a second what that word means to you. A scarecrow. You probably picture something almost comical, a figure made of straw and old clothes, standing in a farmer's field with its arms spread wide, keeping the crows away from the crops. Harmless, even friendly. Children's books are full of scarecrows that come to life and help the protagonist on their journey. There's something almost whimsical about the image. Now, let me tell you what a scarecrow meant on Franklin Patterson's plantation, and I promise you there was nothing whimsical about it. The scarecrow was a punishment device that Patterson had designed himself, and he was genuinely proud of it. Out in the middle of his largest cotton field, he had erected a tall wooden post, about 12 feet high, made from thick oak that wouldn't bend or break no matter how much weight you put on it. At the top of this post, there was a horizontal crossbeam, creating a T shape that cast a long shadow across the cotton rows when the sun was high. Here's how it worked, and I need you to really understand this because it's important to everything that comes after. When someone on the plantation committed what Patterson considered an offense, working too slowly, talking back, trying to rest when they should be working, sometimes just looking at him the wrong way, they would be brought to this post. Their arms would be stretched out along the crossbeam, parallel to the ground, and tied there with thick rope. Their feet would be bound together at the base of the post, and then they would just be left there in the full fury of the Alabama sun, left there without water, without food, without any ability to move or adjust or find even a moment's relief. Left there for everyone else in the fields to see, a living warning of what happened when you displeased Franklin Patterson. The longest anyone had lasted before was 2 days. A man named Samuel, strong as an ox, who had made the mistake of arguing with Patterson about the weight of his cotton sack. They found him on that third morning, still alive, but broken in ways that had nothing to do with his body. He never spoke another word after that, not a single word, until he died 6 months later. Some people said he died of fever. Others said he died of something that didn't have a medical name. But this morning, the morning we're talking about, Franklin Patterson was preparing to use the Scarecrow on someone different. Someone he thought would provide a particularly effective lesson to the rest of his enslaved workforce. Someone whose very presence on that post would send a message so powerful that no one would dare challenge his authority again. He was going to use it on Gideon. Now, let me tell you about Gideon, because understanding who he was is crucial to understanding how this story unfolds. Gideon was a giant. I don't mean that figuratively. I mean the man stood 6 feet and 7 inches tall, with shoulders so broad he had to turn sideways to fit through most doorways. His hands were the size of dinner plates, his arms were thick as tree branches, and when he walked, the ground seemed to acknowledge his presence with each step. He was 28 years old, born on the plantation, the son of a woman named Esther, who had died when he was just a boy. He had his mother's eyes, deep brown, almost black, with a gentleness in them that seemed incongruous with his massive frame. Despite his size, despite the fact that he could have easily broken a man in half with his bare hands, Gideon was known among the enslaved community for being soft-spoken, patient, and kind. Children loved him because he would carve little wooden animals for them in the evenings, using a small knife and whatever scraps of wood he could find. He would tell stories, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder, about a world beyond the plantation, a world he had never seen but liked to imagine. But here's what made Gideon dangerous in Franklin Patterson's eyes. People looked up to him. Not just literally, though of course they did that too. They looked to him for guidance, for protection. When someone was being mistreated by the overseer, Gideon would position himself nearby, his sheer presence often enough to make the overseer think twice about how far he was willing to go. When someone was sick and couldn't make their daily quota, Gideon would work twice as hard to make up the difference, quietly redistributing cotton from his own sack to theirs when no one was looking. He never raised his voice. He never raised his fist. He never did anything that could be explicitly called defiance, but he was a leader, and Franklin Patterson understood something that many people in positions of power understand. True authority doesn't come from a title or a whip. It comes from the people who choose to follow you. And the enslaved people on Patterson's plantation were starting to follow Gideon. That couldn't be allowed to continue. The incident that sealed Gideon's fate happened 3 days before that morning we started with. Patterson had purchased a new overseer, a man named Crenshaw, who had a reputation for cruelty that impressed even Patterson. Crenshaw had decided that the enslaved children, some as young as 6 or 7, weren't working hard enough in the fields. He had devised a new rule. Any child who didn't fill their cotton sack to a weight he determined was acceptable by the end of the day would go without food that evening. The problem was, Crenshaw's expectations were impossible. These were children, their hands small, their stamina limited, working in 100-degree heat. They were already working from sunup to sundown. There was no way they could meet his quotas. Gideon had watched this for 2 days, watched these children grow weaker and hungrier, watched their parents' faces twist with helpless anguish. And on the 3rd day, he did something he had never done before. He approached Patterson directly. It happened in the evening, just as the sun was starting to set. Patterson was standing on the porch of his plantation house, a massive white structure with columns that were meant to evoke ancient Greece, as if building something that looked grand could somehow sanctify the horror that paid for it. Gideon walked right up to the base of those steps, removed his hat, a gesture of respect that probably tasted like poison in his mouth, and spoke in that deep, measured voice of his. "Master Patterson, sir," he said, And you have to understand, calling someone master when you're a man like Gideon must have required every ounce of self-control he possessed. I'm wondering if I might speak with you about the children's quotas. Patterson had been drinking whiskey on the porch, enjoying the slight relief that evening brought from the heat. He looked down at Gideon, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Was it surprise? Anger? Perhaps a touch of fear, though he would never have admitted it. Here was this massive man, standing in the fading light, asking for nothing more than basic mercy for children. And yet, in Patterson's twisted worldview, this simple request was an unforgivable act of insubordination.
"The children's quotas," Patterson repeated, his voice carefully controlled. "You're speaking to me about the children's quotas." "Yes, sir," Gideon continued, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. "They're working hard, sir, working as hard as they can, but they're small, sir. Their hands are small. Maybe if the quotas could be adjusted just a bit, just enough so they could what?" Patterson interrupted, standing up from his chair. "So they could be lazy? So they could learn that if they complain enough, if they get someone big and strong to advocate for them, they can get out of honest work?" "It's not about being lazy, sir," Gideon said. And here's where he made his mistake. His voice stayed calm, but there was something in it, some note of conviction that suggested he saw Patterson not as a master, but as a man who was simply wrong. "They're children. They're hungry. They're tired. I've seen some of them barely able to stand at the end of the day." The porch went very quiet. Even the cicadas seemed to stop their evening song. Patterson descended the steps slowly, deliberately, until he was standing just a few feet from Gideon. He had to tilt his head back to look at the taller man's face, and perhaps that physical reminder of Gideon's size only made his anger burn hotter. "Are you telling me how to run my plantation?" Patterson said, his voice soft now, dangerous. "No, sir," Gideon replied. "I'm just asking if there might be some mercy for mercy." Patterson tasted the word like it was rotten fruit. "You, who eat food I provide, sleep in shelter I provide, exist because I allow you to exist, want to lecture me about mercy." Gideon said nothing. What could he say? Any word would be wrong. Any silence would be wrong. He was in an impossible position, and they both knew it. "I'll tell you what," Patterson said, a smile spreading across his face that held no warmth whatsoever. "I'm going to teach you a lesson about mercy. I'm going to show you exactly what happens when someone questions my authority, when someone thinks they can speak to me like an equal, and I'm going to make sure everyone on this plantation sees it." He turned to his house and called out, "Crenshaw, get out here." The overseer emerged quickly, a thin man with a ferret-like face and eyes that seemed to enjoy witnessing suffering. "Tomorrow morning," Patterson said, loud enough that several of the enslaved people who had been working near the house could hear, "we're going to have a demonstration. Take Gideon here to the Scarecrow, and this time we're going to see just how long a big, strong man like him can last." There was a sharp intake of breath from the people who heard this. The Scarecrow. Everyone knew what that meant. And putting Gideon, beloved Gideon, gentle Gideon, on that device was a message that couldn't be misunderstood. That night, in the slave quarters, the atmosphere was heavy with dread. The quarters consisted of a series of rough wooden cabins, each housing multiple families in conditions that were barely fit for animals, let alone human beings. The walls were thin, the floors were dirt, and in winter the gaps in the boards let in wind that cut like knives. But despite the harsh conditions, these cabins were where community happened, where songs were sung quietly so the overseer wouldn't hear, where stories were passed down, where, despite everything, people tried to maintain their humanity. Gideon sat in the cabin he shared with 5 other men, his massive frame making the small space feel even smaller. He was quiet, his hands clasped together, his head bowed. Around him, the others were debating what to do. "We can't just let them do this," said a man named Joshua, young and hot-headed, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "We're more than 60 people here. They're what, 5 white men? We could what?" interrupted Samuel's widow, Martha, her voice sharp. "Rise up? Fight? And then what happens, Joshua? You think they won't send in the militia? You think they won't hang every one of us, women and children included?
You think they won't make what Patterson does look like kindness compared to what the state of Alabama will do? So we do nothing? Joshua shot back. We just watch while they kill one of us? I'm not saying do nothing, Martha said wearily. I'm saying be smart, be patient, wait for the right moment. There is no right moment, Joshua's voice was rising, emotion overtaking caution. There's never a right moment. When is the right moment, Martha? After they've broken all of us? After they've made us so afraid we forget we're even human? Gideon finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the argument like a knife through butter. Joshua, sit down. The young man sat, unable to resist the gentle authority in Gideon's tone. Tomorrow, they're going to tie me to that post, and there's nothing any of you can do about it. If you try to stop them, they'll kill you. If you try to help me, they'll kill you. If you even look at them wrong while I'm up there, they might kill you. He paused, looking around at the faces in the dim candlelight. I need you all to do nothing. I need you to work in the fields. I need you to keep your heads down. I need you to survive. And what about you? Asked Martha, her eyes glistening with tears. Gideon smiled then, and it was a sad smile, but somehow also peaceful. I'll do what I have to do. I'll last as long as I can. And maybe Patterson's right. Maybe it will be a lesson, just not the lesson he thinks. What do you mean? Someone asked. But Gideon didn't answer. He just sat there in the flickering candlelight, a giant of a man, facing his fate with more dignity than his oppressor would ever possess. Now, there was someone else in those quarters that night, someone we haven't talked about yet, but who will become crucial to this story. Her name was Ruth, and she was 12 years old. Ruth was small for her age, all sharp angles and wide eyes, with hair that her mother tried to keep neat despite the fact that they had no proper comb and no time to tend to such things. She lived in the cabin next to Gideon's with her mother, father, and 3 younger siblings. Ruth was at that particular age where childhood was being forcibly stripped away, but adulthood hadn't yet arrived to replace it. Suspended in between, old enough to understand the horror of their situation, but young enough to still believe that somehow, some way, things could be different. She had been listening to the conversation in Gideon's cabin through the thin walls, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Ruth loved Gideon, not in a romantic way, she was far too young for that, but in the way that children love the adults who show them kindness in a cruel world. Gideon had carved her a small wooden bird once, a cardinal with its wings spread wide as if in flight. She kept it hidden in the hem of her dress, touching it sometimes when she needed to remember that beauty could still exist. The thought of Gideon suffering on the Scarecrow was unbearable to her. She had seen Samuel tied to that post 2 years ago, had seen what it did to him. She remembered his screams, the way his body had convulsed against the ropes, the way the skin on his arms and face had turned red and then purple and then something worse under the relentless sun. She remembered how, on the second day, the screams had stopped, and somehow that silence was even more terrifying than the sound. As she lay on the floor of her cabin that night, there weren't enough proper sleeping spaces for everyone, so the children rotated who got to sleep on the rough wooden planks that served as beds. She made a decision. She didn't know what she was going to do exactly. She just knew that she couldn't do nothing. You see, here's something important about human nature that I think we often overlook. Some of the most courageous acts in history weren't committed by soldiers or leaders or people who had power. They were committed by ordinary people, often young people, who simply couldn't stand by and watch injustice happen. They didn't have plans, they didn't have resources, they just had the absolute certainty that something was wrong and needed to be made right, even if they had no idea how to do it. Ruth was about to become one of those people. The next morning came too quickly. The sun rose over Patterson's plantation like it did every other day, indifferent to human suffering, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if you could forget, even for a moment, what was about to happen beneath it. Gideon was brought out just after dawn. His hands were bound in front of him with rope that bit into his wrists. Crenshaw walked behind him with a rifle, though it was hardly necessary. Gideon wasn't resisting. Every enslaved person on the plantation had been called to witness this. Patterson believed in the power of spectacle, in the idea that punishment was most effective when it was public. Make them watch, he thought. Make them see what happens to anyone who questions authority. So there they all stood, 63 souls arranged in rough rows in front of the Scarecrow, forced to watch as one of their own was about to be tortured for the crime of asking for mercy for children. Patterson stood on a small platform he'd had built for occasions like this. Even in cruelty, he wanted to be elevated, wanted to look down on those he considered beneath him. He was wearing a fine suit despite the early hour, his hair carefully combed, his beard trimmed. He looked like a gentleman. He looked like someone who might go to church on Sunday and sing hymns. He looked like someone who would never imagine himself as a villain. That's the thing about evil, you see. It rarely looks we expect it to. It doesn't wear a monster's face. It doesn't announce itself. It looks normal. It looks respectable. It looks like a man in a fine suit standing in the morning sunlight, about to commit an atrocity and believing with every fiber of his being that he's justified in doing so. "You all know why we're here," Patterson called out, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Gideon here thought he could speak to me like an equal, thought he could tell me how to run my plantation, thought he could question my decisions about how to manage my property." He let that word hang in the air. Property, not people. Property. Well, I want you all to see what happens to property that forgets its place. I want you to watch, and I want you to remember. Because the next person who thinks they can stand up to me, the next person who thinks they can challenge my authority, will find themselves right where Gideon is about to be. Crenshaw and 2 other white men, Patterson's sons, James and William, who had inherited their father's capacity for cruelty, if not his intelligence, began the process of securing Gideon to the Scarecrow. They untied his hands and then roughly grabbed his arms, stretching them out along the horizontal beam. Gideon didn't fight. He could have, easily. One swing of those massive arms, and he could have sent all 3 of them flying, but he knew what would happen if he did. He knew they'd kill him right there, and then they'd probably kill Joshua and Martha and maybe even little Ruth and her family, just to make a point.
So he let them tie him. Let them wrap the rough hemp rope around his wrists, pulling it so tight that it cut off circulation immediately. Let them bind his legs together at the base of the post. Let them step back and admire their work, like craftsmen who had just completed a difficult project. And then they left him there. Standing with his arms outstretched, unable to move, unable to do anything but wait for the sun to rise higher and begin its terrible work. Patterson addressed the crowd one more time. "You'll all work today as usual, and every time you look up from your cotton plants, you'll see Gideon there, and you'll remember. This is what happens when you forget your place. This is the cost of pride. Now get to work." The enslaved people dispersed slowly to the fields, their movements heavy with grief and horror. But they went, because what choice did they have? They picked up their tools and their cotton sacks, and they began the day's work, trying not to look at the post in the middle of the field, but unable to stop themselves. Ruth worked alongside her mother in the rows closest to the Scarecrow. Her mother, whose name was Sarah, worked with tears streaming silently down her face, her hands moving automatically through the cotton plants while her heart broke for Gideon. Ruth worked too, but her mind was racing. There had to be something she could do. But what? She was 12 years old, small, powerless. She had no weapons, no resources, no authority. What could one child possibly do against the entire structure of slavery, against men with guns and whips and the full support of the law? But then she remembered something Gideon had told her once during one of his evening storytelling sessions. She had asked him how a tiny cardinal, the bird he'd carved for her, could survive when there were so many bigger, stronger birds in the world.
"Size isn't everything, little Ruth," he had said in that deep, gentle voice. "A cardinal survives by being smart, by being quick, by understanding its world better than the bigger birds do, and sometimes by having courage bigger than its body." Courage bigger than her body. Could she find that? The morning wore on, and it became clear that this was going to be worse than Samuel's time on the Scarecrow. Samuel had been a big man too, but he'd been older, not as strong. Gideon's very strength was working against him now. His powerful muscles could hold his arms up longer, which meant he wouldn't get the relief of unconsciousness as quickly. His robust constitution meant he could survive longer without water, which meant the suffering would last longer. By mid-morning, the heat was already brutal. The Alabama sun beat down without mercy, turning the air into something thick and oppressive. Gideon's dark skin, which usually had a healthy glow to it, was beginning to take on a dry, ashy appearance. His lips were cracked. Sweat poured down his face, his chest, his arms, but there was no relief in it. The sweat just evaporated instantly in the heat, leaving behind salt that burned his eyes and made the rope chafe even more against his wrists. And yet he didn't scream. Not yet. He kept his eyes closed, his breathing measured, trying to conserve his strength, trying to find some place inside himself where the pain couldn't reach. Patterson came out around noon to check on his handiwork. He stood at the base of the Scarecrow, looking up at Gideon with an expression that was almost curious, like he was conducting an experiment and wanted to see the results. "How are you feeling, Gideon?" he asked, and the false concern in his voice was somehow more obscene than open cruelty would have been. Gideon didn't respond, didn't even open his eyes. "You know, you could end this. All you have to do is apologize. Tell everyone here that you were wrong to speak to me the way you did. Tell them that you forgot your place and you're sorry. Beg for my forgiveness, and I might consider letting you down." For a long moment, there was no response. Then Gideon opened his eyes. He looked down at Patterson, and despite everything, despite the pain, despite the heat, despite the fact that he was tied to a post like an animal, there was something in his gaze that made Patterson take an involuntary step backward. "No," Gideon said, his voice hoarse but clear. That single syllable hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. "No?" Patterson repeated, his face flushing with anger. "You're saying no to me? Even now? Even here?" "I asked you for mercy for children," Gideon said slowly, each word clearly costing him effort. "I'm not going to apologize for that. Not to you, not to anyone." Patterson's hand went to the whip at his belt. He always carried one, the way some men carry pocket watches. But then he stopped himself. The whip was too quick, too merciful in its own terrible way. No, he let the Scarecrow do its work. He let the sun and the rope and the passing hours break this man's spirit in a way the whip never could. "Suit yourself," Patterson said, turning away. "We'll see how defiant you feel tonight, or tomorrow, or the day after that." He walked away, back toward his comfortable house with its shade and its cool drinks and its cushioned chairs, leaving Gideon to suffer. Ruth had been watching this exchange from her position in the fields, her small hands frozen on a cotton ball. She saw Patterson walk away. She saw Gideon close his eyes again, his massive chest rising and falling with labored breaths. And she saw something else, too, something that gave her an idea. She saw that the post of the Scarecrow was old. It had been standing in that field for years, exposed to rain and sun and the slow decay that affects all wooden things. The base of the post, where it went into the ground, was slightly loose, not enough that you'd notice if you weren't looking for it, not enough that Gideon's weight would topple it. The post was thick and strong, but loose enough that maybe, just maybe, if someone were to dig at the base of it during the night when no one was watching, if someone were small and quick and brave enough to try. But that was just the beginning of an idea that wasn't fully formed yet, an idea that would need help to execute, and Ruth knew that if she was going to try something, anything, she couldn't do it alone.
The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. The sun traced its arc across the sky, and every hour it beat down on Gideon with increasing intensity. By mid-afternoon, he had started to sway slightly against his bonds, his body's desperate attempt to find some position that didn't hurt quite so much. His lips were bleeding now from where they'd cracked, and his wrists were a mess of raw, torn flesh where the rope had dug in. The enslaved people working in the fields tried to focus on their tasks, but it was impossible. Gideon's suffering was a weight on all of them, a physical presence that you couldn't ignore. Some of the older women hummed spirituals under their breath as they worked, songs about crossing rivers and going home and seeing promised lands, songs that spoke of hope in code that the white overseers couldn't quite decipher. Ruth worked and watched and planned. She knew what she had to do, but she needed allies. She needed people who would be willing to take a risk, who still had enough fire in them to try something that might fail spectacularly and get them all killed. She needed Joshua. When the sun finally began to set, that golden hour when the heat finally relented slightly and the air became almost breathable again, the field workers were dismissed back to their quarters. They would get their meager meal of cornmeal and salt pork, they would have an hour or two before darkness fell, and then they would try to sleep, despite the heat and the mosquitoes and the knowledge that Gideon was still out there, suffering. Ruth waited until her mother was distracted with preparing food, then slipped out of their cabin. She found Joshua sitting outside his quarters, his head in his hands. He looked up as she approached. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I need to talk to you," Ruth whispered, getting close and quiet. "About Gideon, about doing something." Joshua's eyes widened. "Little girl, we already talked about this. There's nothing we can do. If we try anything, they'll—"
"Kill us, I know," Ruth interrupted, her voice urgent. "But they're killing Gideon anyway. They're killing him slowly and making us watch. And if we don't do anything, if we just let it happen, then what's next? Who's next? Your sister? My mother? How many of us have to die before we at least try?" Joshua stared at her, this tiny slip of a girl who somehow had more courage in her little finger than he felt in his entire body at that moment. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally. And Ruth told him. It wasn't a complete plan, how could it be? But it was something. It was a chance. A tiny, desperate, probably futile chance, but a chance nonetheless. The plan hinged on several things that had to go exactly right. First, they needed to wait until deep night, when Patterson and his sons were asleep, when the overseer Crenshaw had drunk enough whiskey to make him less alert. Second, they needed to work quickly and quietly. Third, they needed to be willing to face the consequences if they failed. "This is crazy," Joshua said when she finished explaining. "I know. We'll probably die. Maybe. You're 12 years old. I know that too." Ruth's voice was steady. "But I also know that Gideon carved me a bird once. He made something beautiful just to make me smile. He's never hurt anyone. He just asked Patterson to be kind to children. And now he's dying out there because of it. I can't—" her voice cracked. "I can't just do nothing." Joshua looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Okay. But we need more people. We need tools. We need to be smart," Ruth finished. "Like Gideon always said, smart and quick and brave." They spent the next hour quietly recruiting. They couldn't tell everyone. Some people were too afraid, too broken by years of abuse to risk anything. And that was okay. Ruth understood that. But they found a handful of people willing to try. Joshua's sister, Mary, an older man named Thomas who had been a carpenter before being sold to Patterson and knew something about how wooden structures could be weakened. Martha, Samuel's widow, who said that her husband would want her to try to save someone if she could. By the time full darkness fell, they had a group of 8 people, counting Ruth. 8 people who were going to attempt something that could either save Gideon or get them all killed, possibly both. Out in the field, Gideon had survived his first day on the Scarecrow, but barely. His body had reached the point where the pain was so constant, so overwhelming, that it almost became a kind of numbness. His throat was raw for thirst, his skin felt like it was on fire, and his arms, God, his arms felt like they were being slowly pulled from their sockets. But he was still conscious, still aware, and as night fell and brought with it some relief from the sun's fury, he found himself thinking about his mother. Esther had died when he was 8, worked to death in these same fields, and her last words to him were, "Don't let them make you small, baby. You're meant for bigger things than this." At the time, he hadn't understood what she meant. How could he be meant for bigger things? He was enslaved. He would live his whole life in chains, literal or otherwise. But now, tied to this post, suffering for the crime of caring about children, he thought maybe he understood. Being meant for bigger things didn't mean escaping slavery or becoming free. It meant refusing let the horror of your circumstances crush your humanity. It meant standing up even when standing up meant you'd fall. The night sounds surrounded him. Crickets and frogs and the distant hoot of an owl. Somewhere in the darkness he heard movement. Footsteps, quiet and careful. Multiple sets of them. His first thought was that Patterson was coming to check on him, to gloat or worse. But then he heard a small voice, barely above a whisper. "Gideon, can you hear me?" Ruth. "Child," he managed to rasp out, his voice barely working. "What are you doing here?" "Saving you," she whispered back, and there was such fierce determination in those 2 words that despite everything, despite the pain and the exhaustion and the sheer impossibility of the situation, Gideon almost smiled. The group moved quickly. Thomas had brought a small shovel he'd managed to steal from the tool shed, and he began digging at the base of the post where it met the ground. Joshua and Mary worked at the ropes binding Gideon's wrists, trying to loosen them without causing more damage to his already torn flesh. Martha and 2 others kept watch, ready to alert the group if anyone approached. Ruth stood in front of Gideon, looking up at him in the darkness. "This might not work," she said honestly. "I know," Gideon replied, "but we had to try." "I know that too." "Did it hurt?" Ruth asked. And she wasn't just asking about the physical pain. She was asking about everything, about what it felt like to stand up to Patterson, to choose principle over survival, to suffer for doing what was right. Gideon looked down at this brave little girl, and even in his weakened state, even barely clinging to consciousness, he gave her an honest answer. "Yes," he said, "it hurt. It hurts. But you know what would hurt more? Looking at you and all the other children and knowing I didn't even try. Knowing I stayed silent when I could have spoken. That would hurt worse than anything Patterson could do to me." There was a sharp intake of breath from Joshua. "The rope's not budging. It's too tight, and his wrists are too swollen." "Keep trying," insisted Ruth. Thomas was making progress on the post. The more he dug, the more the old wood revealed how rotten it was at its base. This thing had been standing here for years, slowly decaying, and nobody had bothered to check its integrity because why would they? It was just a torture device. Who cares if it's structurally sound, as long as it holds a person up long enough to break them? "We might be able to topple it," whispered Thomas, "if we can get it loose enough, and if we all push together." "No," interrupted Gideon. "If you topple it, I'll fall. With my arms still bound, it could break my neck or my spine. We need to free my hands first." They worked in tense silence, every second feeling like an eternity. The moon was bright tonight, which helped them see, but also made them visible to anyone who might look out from the plantation house. Every sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made them freeze, hearts pounding, waiting for the shout that would mean they'd been discovered. And then, finally, Joshua managed to work one of the knots loose. It wasn't much, but it was enough that they could start to unwrap the rope. Gideon's wrists were so damaged that even this gentle removal was agony, but he bit down on his lip and stayed silent. They got one hand free, then started on the other. Gideon was able to help now despite the pain, using his free hand to work at the knots. And then, the sound of a door opening, the creak of hinges that every person there recognized instantly, the front door of the plantation house. Everyone froze. Footsteps on the porch. Then Crenshaw's voice, slurred with drink but still coherent enough to be dangerous. "I'm gonna check on that big buck, make sure he hasn't died on us yet. Boss wants him to suffer at least 3 days." The group looked at each other in panic. They were exposed, standing right here in the moonlight. There was nowhere to hide, no way to explain what they were doing. If Crenshaw saw them, if he raised the alarm. But then Gideon did something extraordinary. Even with one hand still bound, even with his body wrecked by a day of torture, he spoke in a loud, clear voice that carried across the field. "Overseer Crenshaw, thank the Lord. I've been thinking about what Master Patterson said. You're right. He's right. I was wrong to speak to him that way. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, can you tell him I want to apologize? Please?" It was a performance worthy of a stage actor. Gideon's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine remorse. He sounded broken, defeated, exactly how Patterson would want him to sound.
The footsteps stopped. Then Crenshaw laughed, a sound ugly with satisfaction. "Now that's what I like to hear. Took you long enough to come to your senses. But the master's asleep now. You can tell him yourself in the morning. That is, if you last that long." More laughter, then the sound of Crenshaw stumbling back into the house. The door closed. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Gideon looked down at Ruth and winked. Actually winked with one of his eyes that was swollen nearly shut. "Bought us some time," he whispered. "Now hurry." They worked even faster now, knowing it might be their only chance. The second rope came free, and Gideon nearly collapsed as his arms, finally released after hours of being stretched out, dropped to his sides. The pain of blood rushing back into his limbs was intense, but Joshua and Mary caught him, held him steady. Thomas and 2 others pushed at the post while Gideon's weight was no longer on it, and with a crack that sounded thunderous in the quiet night, the base of the post broke. The whole structure tilted, then fell, landing in the cotton plants with a thud that seemed certain to wake everyone on the plantation. But nobody came. Either they didn't hear, or they heard and decided it wasn't their problem until morning. "Can you walk?" Ruth whispered to Gideon. He tried to take a step and nearly fell. His legs, bound together for so many hours, weren't working properly. Joshua got under one of his arms, Thomas under the other, and together they started half carrying, half dragging him toward the tree line at the edge of the cotton field. "Wait," Gideon managed to say. "Where are we going?" "Away from here," Joshua said. But Gideon shook his head. "No, no running, not yet." "What are you talking about?" Martha hissed. "We need to get you hidden before morning, before Patterson sees." "Patterson needs to see something," Gideon interrupted. "He needs to see that the Scarecrow is broken, that his perfect punishment device failed. He needs to see that we're not as powerless as he thinks." "You want to send him a message," Ruth said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I want to send everyone a message," Gideon replied. "This can't just be about me escaping. It has to be about something bigger." And so they did something that was either brilliant or insane, and perhaps both. They spent the next hour working in near darkness, using what tools they had and what strength remained to them to do something that would change everything. When Franklin Patterson walked out onto his porch the next morning, his coffee in hand, expecting to see Gideon still suffering on the Scarecrow as a warning to everyone else, he instead saw something that made him drop his cup. The china shattered on the wooden boards, coffee spreading like blood, but he barely noticed. The Scarecrow was gone, not just fallen, gone. The post had been broken apart and the pieces arranged in the field to spell out a single word in letters 10 feet tall. Enough. And that wasn't all. Gideon was sitting at the base of where the Scarecrow had been, right there in plain sight. He hadn't run, he hadn't hidden. He was just sitting there, waiting as the sun rose over the plantation. His wrists were torn and bloody, his face was sunburned and swollen, his lips were cracked and bleeding. But he was alive, and he was looking directly at the plantation house with an expression that contained no fear whatsoever. Around him,
Emerging from their cabins as the morning bell rang, the other enslaved people saw what had happened. They saw the broken scarecrow. They saw the words spelled out in wood. They saw Gideon sitting there, unbowed. And something shifted in the air of that plantation. Something intangible, but absolutely real. Patterson stood on his porch, his face cycling through a series of emotions: shock, rage, fear, and finally a kind of calculating coldness. He called for Crenshaw, for his sons, for his rifle. This was rebellion. This was exactly the kind of thing that plantation owners had nightmares about. This couldn't be allowed to stand. But here's the thing about power that Patterson was about to learn. It's not actually as absolute as those who wield it like to believe. Power is, in many ways, a performance. It works because people agree to believe in it, to accept that the person in charge has authority. But what happens when people stop believing? What happens when someone demonstrates that the emperor has no clothes, that the all-powerful master is just a man, and a cruel, small one at that? Patterson descended from his porch, rifle in hand, his sons flanking him. Crenshaw was there too, looking nervous despite his weapon. They approached Gideon slowly, and the enslaved people, all 63 of them, stopped their morning preparations and watched. "You should have died on that post," said Patterson, his voice shaking with rage. "You should have broken. You should have begged." Gideon looked up at him. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse and ragged, but every word carried across the silent field. "You can't break something that was never yours to break," he said. Patterson raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Gideon's head. "I could kill you right now, right here, and nobody would stop me. Nobody would question it. You're my property, and I can do whatever I want with you." "Then do it," said Gideon calmly. "Pull that trigger. Kill me in front of all these people. Show them exactly what kind of man you are." For a long, terrible moment, it seemed like Patterson might actually do it. His finger tightened on the trigger. But then he looked around and saw what Gideon saw. All those faces watching, witnessing, remembering. If he killed Gideon now, he might be within his legal rights, but he would also be showing his hand. He would be proving that violence was all he had, that his authority existed only at the end of a gun barrel. More than that, though, something else was happening. The enslaved people weren't backing down. They weren't looking away. They were standing together, a silent wall of witnesses. Joshua was there, and Martha, and Thomas. Little Ruth was standing in front of her mother, that carved wooden bird clutched in her small fist like a talisman. If Patterson killed Gideon, what would stop them from rising up? There were 63 of them, and only 5 white men on the plantation. Oh, Patterson could call for help from neighboring plantations, from the militia, and they would come and they would crush any rebellion with terrifying force. But in the immediate moment, in this instant, the balance of power was not as tilted as Patterson wanted to believe. He lowered the rifle slowly. "You've just signed your own death warrant," said Gideon. "You and everyone who helped you. I'll find out who they were. I'll make examples of them all. Maybe you'll realize that this can't continue. Maybe you'll understand that you can't break people forever without something breaking in return." Patterson turned and walked back to his house, his sons and Crenshaw following. He was making a strategic retreat, but everyone understood it was temporary. He would regroup. He would decide how to respond. And that response would almost certainly be terrible. But in that moment, something had changed. The enslaved people had seen one of their own stand up to their master and survive. They had seen the scarecrow, the symbol of Patterson's cruelty, reduced to broken wood in the dirt. They had seen that word, enough, spelled out in letters that couldn't be ignored. It's important to understand what happened next not as a simple happy ending, because it wasn't. History is rarely that clean. What happened in the days following Gideon's night of suffering and survival was complex and messy and still painful, but it was also transformative.
Patterson didn't kill Gideon. He wanted to, but he couldn't figure out how to do it in a way that wouldn't turn Gideon into a martyr. So instead, he tried a different approach. He attempted to sell Gideon to another plantation, to get rid of this troublemaker and recoup his investment at the same time. But word had spread. The story of what happened on Patterson's plantation traveled the way stories do in oppressed communities, whispered from one person to another, carried by house slaves who overheard their masters talking, passed along by the few free black people who worked as tradesmen and could move between plantations. Within a week, every plantation owner in Wilcox County knew about the slave who had broken the Scarecrow and faced down his master, and none of them wanted to buy him. Not because they admired what he did, quite the opposite. They saw Gideon as dangerous. They saw him as someone who might inspire their own slaves to rebellion. The story of what he'd done was already spreading among the enslaved population like wildfire, and the last thing any plantation owner wanted was to import that kind of inspiration onto their own property. So Patterson was stuck with him, and that meant he had to make a choice. Continue to escalate, risk a full rebellion, and possibly lose everything, or find some way to maintain his authority while making peace with the new reality that his enslaved people were less controllable than he'd thought. He chose a middle path, though calling it peace would be too generous. He abolished the Scarecrow, not out of any moral awakening, but because it had become a symbol of his failure rather than his power. He eased up on some of the worst punishments, particularly the starvation of children that had started this whole situation, and he left Gideon alone, treating him with the kind of wary distance you might give to a dangerous animal you know you can't fully control. It wasn't freedom, it wasn't justice, but it was space to breathe. It was slightly less suffering, and in the world of slavery in 1857 Alabama, that was something. Gideon recovered slowly from his ordeal on the Scarecrow. His wrists bore scars for the rest of his life, thick rope burns that never fully faded. His shoulders sometimes ached on cold mornings, damage from hours of being stretched beyond their natural range. But he survived. More than that, he remained himself, gentle, kind, still carving little wooden animals for children in the evenings. Ruth kept her wooden bird. Years later, when the Civil War came and the enslaved people of Patterson's plantation were finally freed, she still had it. She would keep it for the rest of her life, a reminder that courage doesn't require size or strength or power. Sometimes it just requires the willingness to say enough and mean it. But perhaps most importantly, what happened that night in 1857 became part of the collective memory of the enslaved community in that part of Alabama. It became a story that parents told their children, that young people whispered to each other when the overseers weren't listening. It became proof that resistance was possible, that standing up to cruelty, even when the cost was terrible, could sometimes achieve something. The details changed over time, the way stories do. Some versions said Gideon broke his bonds with pure strength. Others said divine intervention made the Scarecrow fall. Some said 100 people helped in the rescue. Others said it was Gideon alone who escaped. But the core truth remained. A man stood up for children and survived. A group of people risked everything to save one of their own, and a symbol of terror was reduced to broken wood and a message that couldn't be erased. Now, I want to talk about something important before we finish this story, because I think it's easy to hear about resistance to slavery and imagine it only in terms of dramatic escapes or violent uprisings or the Underground Railroad. And those things were real and important. But most resistance to slavery looked like what Gideon did. It looked like small acts of defiance. It looked like maintaining your humanity in a system designed to strip it away. It looked like caring for each other when caring made you vulnerable. It looked like refusing to let cruelty become normal, even when that refusal cost you everything. The enslaved people in America resisted slavery every single day, in ways large and small.
They resisted by preserving their families, even when those families could be torn apart at any moment. They resisted by passing down stories and songs and skills. They resisted by teaching their children to read, even though it was illegal and dangerous. They resisted by working slowly, by breaking tools accidentally, by feigning ignorance, by running away even when they knew they'd probably be caught. They resisted by building communities and maintaining their dignity and refusing to become the inhuman property their masters claimed they were. And sometimes they resisted by breaking a scarecrow. Franklin Patterson lived another 8 years after the events of 1857. He died in 1865, just weeks before Lee surrendered at Appomattox and the Civil War ended. He never saw slavery abolished. He never had to confront the full moral horror of what he'd done. He died thinking he'd been a good man, a righteous man, a man who'd maintained order and discipline on his plantation. History tends to forget men like Patterson. There are hundreds of thousands of them, maybe millions. People who participated in monstrous systems and convinced themselves they were just doing what was normal, what was necessary, what was their right. They're forgotten because they were ordinary in their evil. They weren't unique. They were just one more brick in a massive wall of injustice. But history remembers people like Gideon, even if we don't always know their names. We remember them because they remind us of something essential about human nature, that we have a choice. Even in the most oppressive circumstances, even when the cost is terrible, we can choose to stand up. We can choose to say enough. We can choose to maintain our humanity.
Gideon lived to see emancipation. When the news came that slavery had been abolished, that they were free, he was 46 years old. He had spent his entire life enslaved, had never known anything else, and suddenly the world had changed in ways he'd never even dared to dream about. There's a record, a brief one, from a Freedmen's Bureau agent who passed through Wilcox County in 1866 that mentions a man named Gideon who had become a leader in the newly freed community. The agent noted that this Gideon was a man of remarkable presence and dignity, who commands respect from all who know him. The agent also noted that Gideon still bore visible scars on his wrists and often spoke to younger people about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. We don't know when Gideon died. The records from that time and place are incomplete, and formerly enslaved people weren't always carefully documented. But we know he lived at least into his 50s, long enough to vote in elections, long enough to see his community begin to build schools and churches, long enough to witness the beginning of Reconstruction. And Ruth? Ruth grew up to become a teacher. When schools for black children began opening in Alabama during Reconstruction, she was among the first to volunteer to educate the next generation. She married a man named Samuel, no relation to the Samuel who died from the scarecrow, though she always said she chose the name to honor his memory, and they had 5 children. She taught those children to read and write, and she taught them about courage, too. She taught them that standing up for what's right is more important than staying safe, that dignity matters even when it's dangerous, that resistance to injustice is not just a right, but a responsibility. When she was an old woman in the 1890s, she would sit with her grandchildren and tell them the story of the night they broke the scarecrow. By then, the details had become somewhat mythologized in her memory. Gideon had become even larger than life, the scarecrow had become even more terrifying, the night of the rescue had become even more dramatic. But the core truth remained. People stood up. People said enough. And things changed, even if just a little bit, even if just for a moment. One of her grandchildren wrote down the story, and that's actually how we know as much as we do about what happened that night in 1857. The account exists in a collection of oral histories from former slaves and their descendants, housed in a library archive in Alabama. It's not a famous document. Historians who study slavery usually don't reference it because there's no way to independently verify all the details. But it's there, preserved, a testament to the fact that these events happened and these people lived, and their courage mattered. Because here's the thing about history. What we remember and what we forget is often a matter of power.
The people who write the history books tend to write about kings and presidents and generals and wealthy industrialists. They write about the big, dramatic moments, the wars and the treaties and the elections. And those things are important, certainly. But the truth is, history is made just as much by people whose names we'll never know. It's made by a 12-year-old girl who decided she couldn't just watch someone suffer. It's made by a group of people who risked everything to save one person because that one person mattered. It's made by a man who stood up for children even though it cost him everything. It's made by thousands of small acts of courage that accumulate over time until suddenly the impossible becomes possible and the world shifts on its axis. The story of Gideon and Ruth and that night in 1857 is not a story about slavery being defeated by individual heroism. That would be a false and even harmful narrative. Slavery was a massive institutional evil that required massive institutional responses to defeat it. It took a civil war and hundreds of thousands of deaths and constitutional amendments and federal troops and decades of struggle by millions of people to end slavery and begin the long, still unfinished work of creating actual equality. But within that larger story, there are thousands of smaller stories like this one. Stories of people who refused to accept the dehumanization that slavery demanded. Stories of resistance that may not have changed the whole system, but that changed something. Changed the people involved, changed their communities, changed what seemed possible. There's a concept in physics called critical mass, the point at which enough of something accumulates that it triggers a chain reaction. You could think of the abolition of slavery in similar terms. It wasn't one event or one person or one moment. It was thousands upon thousands of moments like the one I've told you about, accumulating over centuries, until finally the system became unsustainable and collapsed. Every enslaved person who ran away, every person who helped on the Underground Railroad, every abolitionist who spoke out, every person who preserved their family and their culture and their humanity despite every effort to strip those things away, they were all adding to that critical mass. They were all making the impossible slightly more possible, the intolerable slightly more intolerable, until finally change became inevitable.
And that brings us to the real lesson of this story, the thing I want you to take away from these 60-plus minutes we've spent together. You see, it's easy to look at history and feel overwhelmed. It's easy to see the massive systems of injustice. Slavery, yes, but also all the injustices that exist in our world today. And think, what can one person do? What difference can I make? The problems are too big. The forces arrayed against change are too powerful, and I'm just one person. But Gideon was just one person. Ruth was just one person. Joshua and Martha and Thomas, they were all just people. Ordinary people who had fewer resources and less power and fewer options than almost anyone reading this story today. And yet they did something. They stood up. They said enough. And it mattered. It didn't end slavery. It didn't revolutionize the plantation system. It didn't even free them, at least not immediately. But it broke a scarecrow. It gave people hope. It demonstrated that resistance was possible. It preserved dignity in a system designed to destroy it. And maybe that's what courage really is. Not the absence of fear, not the possession of power, not even the guarantee of success. Maybe courage is just the willingness to say enough when you see something wrong, even when you don't know if it will make a difference. Maybe courage is doing what's right, not because you'll be rewarded for it or because it will definitely succeed, but simply because it's right. In 2024, there's a small church in Wilcox County, Alabama, not far from where Franklin Patterson's plantation once stood. The plantation house burned down in 1893, and the land has changed hands many times. Most people who live in the area don't even know there was once a plantation there, let alone what happened on it. But in that church, there's a small museum dedicated to the history of the local black community. And in that museum, there's a display case with a single artifact, a carved wooden bird, a cardinal with its wings spread wide. The placard next to it says, "This bird was carved by Gideon,
an enslaved man who stood up to injustice in 1857. It was given to a young girl named Ruth, who kept it her whole life and passed it down to her children with the story of courage it represented. May we all find the courage to stand up, to say enough, and to believe that our actions matter. The bird is worn smooth from years of being held, of being touched by fingers seeking comfort or courage. The wood has darkened with age, but it's still recognizable as a cardinal, still beautiful in its simplicity, still a testament to the fact that even in the darkest circumstances, people create beauty, maintain hope, and resist in whatever ways they can. I visited that museum last year while researching this story. I stood in front of that display case for a long time, looking at that wooden bird, thinking about the hands that carved it and the hands that held it and all the years of history it has witnessed. And I thought about something Ruth said in one of those oral histories her grandson recorded. She said, "People asked me sometimes if I was scared that night when we broke the scarecrow, and the truth is I was terrified. I was 12 years old and I thought we were all going to die. But I was more scared of doing nothing. I was more scared of waking up the next day and having to live with the fact that I could have tried to help and didn't. That scared me more than Patterson or his guns or anything else. More scared of doing nothing than of the consequences of doing something. That's a profound way to think about courage. The world still has its scarecrows, systems and structures and symbols of injustice designed to keep people in their place, to make them afraid, to convince them that resistance is futile. They look different now than they did in 1857. They're often more subtle, more insidious, harder to see and harder to break, but they exist. And the world still has its Gideons and its Ruths, people who look at those scarecrows and say, enough. People who stand up even when it costs them. People who organize and resist and work for change even when the odds are overwhelming. People who maintain their humanity and their dignity and their hope in the face of systems designed to crush all three. The question that each of us has to answer is, which side are we on? Are we maintaining the scarecrows, actively or passively supporting systems of injustice because they benefit us or because challenging them seems too hard? Are we the people in the fields who want to help but are too afraid to try? Or are we willing to be like Ruth, like Gideon, like those brave souls who risked everything because they were more afraid of doing nothing than of the consequences of doing something?
These aren't easy questions, and I'm not here to judge anyone's answers to them. The circumstances of 1857 Alabama and the circumstances of today are different in countless ways. But I do think this story asks us to reflect on how we respond to injustice when we see it. Do we look away? Do we tell ourselves it's not our problem? Do we wait for someone else to do something? Or do we find the courage, however small, to stand up? Sometimes standing up means grand gestures, organizing protests, starting movements, speaking truth to power in dramatic ways. But sometimes it means smaller things. It means speaking up when someone tells a racist joke. It means donating to organizations fighting injustice. It means voting, volunteering, using whatever privilege or platform or resources you have to make things a little bit better. It means being kind to someone who's suffering, even when that kindness makes you vulnerable. It means carving a wooden bird for a child who needs to know that beauty and hope still exist. All of these things matter. All of these things are resistance. All of these things are ways of breaking scarecrows bit by bit. And here's the hopeful part of this story, the part that makes me believe human beings are capable of extraordinary things. Change is possible. Systems that seem unbreakable can break. Justice that seems impossible can arrive. Not easily, not quickly, not without tremendous cost and sacrifice and suffering, but it can happen. Slavery was once the foundation of the American economy. It was legal. It was defended by politicians and theologians and intellectuals who created elaborate justifications for why it was natural and right and necessary.
It seemed permanent, and yet it ended. It ended because people resisted. It ended because people said enough. It ended because thousands of Gideons and millions of Ruths across generations maintained their humanity and fought for freedom in whatever ways they could. It ended because the critical mass was reached and the impossible became possible. What injustices in our world today seem permanent, seem too big to change, seem inevitable? What scarecrows are standing in our fields designed to keep people in their place? And what would it mean for us to break them? I don't have all the answers to those questions. Nobody does. But I know this. If a 12-year-old enslaved girl and a handful of desperate people could break a scarecrow in 1857 Alabama, if they could resist one of the most powerful and brutal systems of oppression in human history and achieve something that mattered, then we can find ways to resist the injustices we face today. We have more resources than they did, more freedom, more options, more power. If they could stand up with so little, what's our excuse for not standing up with so much? As the sun set on Franklin Patterson's plantation on the evening after Gideon's rescue, as the enslaved people prepared for another night in the quarters, as Ruth clutched her wooden bird and Gideon tried to recover from his ordeal, the world hadn't fundamentally changed. Slavery still existed. Patterson still owned his land and his human property. The law still sanctioned the system. The federal government still protected it. But something had shifted. A scarecrow was broken. A message had been sent. People had remembered that they were human beings, not property. They had remembered that resistance was possible, that courage was real, that even in the darkest circumstances there was still choice, still agency, still hope. And maybe that's what we need to remember too. Maybe that's the lesson that reaches across more than 160 years to speak to us today. The world is full of injustice. Systems of oppression still exist. There are still scarecrows standing in our fields, still forces trying to keep people in their place, still reasons to be afraid. But there are also still people who stand up, still people who say enough, still people who resist, still people who maintain their humanity and their dignity and their hope even when everything seems hopeless. Still people who carve wooden birds for children who need to know that beauty exists. The story of Gideon and Ruth and that night in 1857 is ultimately a story about the indomitable human spirit. It's a story about the fact that we are more than our circumstances, more than what systems of oppression say we are, more than the limitations placed on us by people who would rather we stayed powerless. It's a story about courage, yes, but more than that, it's a story of love. Because that's really what courage is in its purest form. Love put into action. Love for others, love for justice, love for dignity and humanity and all the things that make life worth living. Love that says, I cannot watch you suffer and do nothing. I cannot accept this cruelty as normal. I cannot let this stand.
Gideon loved those children enough to risk everything for them. Ruth loved Gideon enough to try to save him even when it seemed impossible. The others who helped that night loved their community enough to put themselves in danger. And maybe that's what resistance always comes down to in the end. Love strong enough to overcome fear. So here's my challenge to you as we finish this story. Look for the scarecrows in your life, in your community, in your world. Look for the systems and structures and symbols that are designed to keep people oppressed, to make them afraid, to convince them that change is impossible. Look for the injustices that we've been told are just the way things are. And then ask yourself, what would it mean to break them? What would it mean to say enough? What would it mean to love justice more than you fear the consequences of pursuing it? You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to solve everything at once. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing to try, to do something, to stand up, even in small ways, and refuse to accept that cruelty and injustice are inevitable. Because they're not inevitable. History proves they're not. Slavery ended. Jim Crow ended. Countless other injustices have been fought and defeated by ordinary people who decided they would rather risk everything than do nothing. And who knows, maybe someday, more than a century from now, someone will tell the story of what you did. Maybe they'll talk about how you stood up, how you said enough, how you refused to let the scarecrows of our time stand unchallenged. Maybe your courage will inspire someone else to be brave. Maybe your resistance will be part of the critical mass that finally topples the injustices we face today. Or maybe not. Maybe your actions will seem small and insignificant. Maybe you'll break a scarecrow that nobody else notices, in a field nobody else sees, and history won't record it. But here's the secret. It still matters. It matters to the people you help. It matters to the community you're part of. It matters to the person you become by choosing to stand up rather than to look away. It matters to that 12-year-old girl inside you who knows the difference between right and wrong and refuses to compromise on it. The sun rises every morning on a world full of scarecrows, but it also rises on a world full of people who are brave enough, loving enough, stubborn enough to break them. Which kind of person will you be? That's the question Gideon and Ruth answered in 1857. That's the question that echoes across the years to us today. That's the question that each of us in our own circumstances and with our own resources and in our own ways has to answer for ourselves. I hope we choose courage. I hope we choose love. I hope we choose to stand up. Because somewhere, right now, there's a scarecrow that needs breaking. And somewhere, right now, there's someone waiting for the courage to break it. Maybe that someone is you.